Hi there, and welcome to Shapers, Makers, Builders, and Breakers. I'm your host today, Benjamin Shaw. Shapers is the podcast show that brings you African leadership stories in all spheres of society, where we interview exceptional individuals telling us their story.
This podcast is brought to you by EXEO Capital. EXEO Capital is a leading alternative private equity fund manager that through its 15-year history have focused on investing in African businesses with purpose and impact. EXEO covers the whole of the African continent with investment teams based in Cape Town, South Africa and Nairobi, Kenya, currently managing investments in 9 African countries. The core investment thesis revolves around partnering with exceptional businesses and their teams that have the ability to impact Africa in the decades to come. EXEO does this through providing growth capital to these businesses, but more than that, leveraging a partnership ethos with the companies they invest in. For more information, please have a look at their website, www.exeocapital.com. That is www.exeocapital.com. We hope that you will enjoy today's conversation as much as we enjoyed recording it. Without any further delay, let's dive into our next episode of Shapers, Makers, Builders, and Breakers.
Well, welcome to another Shapers podcast episode with myself, Benjamin Shaw. We've got Bernard Laurendeau joining us today, and a very interesting segment of the market that we're going to look at, the interest of Japan and the Japanese businesses in coming into Africa. So I think we can dive right in, and I'd like Bernard to give us a bit of an overview. What does it mean for you to expand to Africa, and maybe tell us a bit about yourself and why your company is bringing Japanese businesses into the continent?
Sure. So thanks for having me on your podcast, Ben. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I think on the African continent have a big opportunity in terms of really growing our economies. I think most of the countries are at our crossroad, and we need to select our multilateral, but also bilateral partners very carefully. Why Japan, and why be in the backyard of Japanese corporations here in Tokyo? Well, it's because, first of all, in the short term, TICAD is happening. TICAD is this large conference between African leaders and the Japanese government. It's happening every 3 years, and it's been happening consistently for the last 30 years. Once in, the way they do it is it's once in Africa, and then the next time around it happens in Yokohama, and so on and so forth. So
is that a conference? Or what exactly is that?
Yeah, so TICAD is this large conference. So you know how nowadays a lot of African leaders, and they get a lot of heat for that sometimes. They go to a country, it could be Italy, it could be Turkey or Russia. I think even recently they all went to Kazakhstan or something like that. So, France has been also the norm for quote unquote for a few decades. The US,
right.
But Japan has been doing this consistently, even though they don't historically have a specific, relationship with Africa. It's not like, for instance, Europe with the whole background of the last centuries, etc. But Japan has made it a point for the last 30 years to have this conference, and it's been again happening for many years and consistently. So why Japan? I mean, I think it's one of those trade partners that, in terms of quantity, maybe it's not the largest as compared, especially to China, but in terms of the quality of the investments and the trade, I think, at least in my humble opinion, I think it's one of the best, because this is where you could really get a good amount of technology transfer and knowledge transfer, right? And this is really what, again, at this crossroad for a lot of African economies, this is what these economies really need, right? Is a massive injection of know-how. And then maybe we can talk about the human capital later, but at least, the know-how is very, very important to really have a bunch of industries take off, right? So our firm, we're a management consulting firm, but we've partnered with a few strategic alliance partners here for our Tokyo venture, namely with the Kasi Insight as well as the culture factor, to do two things. Number one, to arm our clients with very specific and timely data that is either real-time or AI-based. And then with our culture factor strategic alliance partner to really arm them with intercultural management tools, which is, again, quite important. If you can imagine a Japanese businessman landing in Nairobi or Lagos, pick your favorite capital of an African country. Usually, right, the intercultural management aspect there is really, really important. I mean, it's important anywhere in the world, but I think for Africa, it's even more important because not much has been really written.
And of course, Japan is one of the outliers, even in terms of developed culture. I recall in my banking career having to go through specific training before we would meet the executives of Mitsubishi and some of the other manufacturing companies. So that's an interesting one. We'll come back to culture. And you also mentioned the use of AI, bringing tools that will help Japanese companies generate insight into Africa. But maybe before we talk more about the company and what it does, let's get a bit of a view of yourself. You've made it your business to solve these challenges in Africa. What led to that? What's the background that brings Bernard back to Africa time and again?
Yeah, so I can say I'm a product of really different cultures, to be honest, different countries. I mean, born and raised in Ethiopia, so definitely culturally there, I'm very Ethiopian, but I'm also very French because my blood is half French, half Ethiopian. Let's start with that. But in terms of the influence, definitely, because I was born and raised in Ethiopia, I know a thing or two about the Ethiopian culture. But, I was educated in the French system in Ethiopia and then in France as well. But then I spent most of my career in the US. And so I think at the core, I feel like I'm a very, I don't know if capitalist is the right term, but I've seen how corporate America functions. And I think that model is I think, one of the best. And if you look at most of the countries that have really made a dramatic amount of growth in their economies in the last century, I mean, most of them have adopted these tenets of capitalism, right? So, but including Japan, by the way. And by the way, for the fun fact, Japan actually went to France to kind of understand what capitalism meant. It didn't come from the US, at least at the onset. But because you would think, right, that with the American, I would say, influence and history there. But anyway.
Right.
So, I mean, I most of my career was in the U.S. In management consulting, also in banking. I traveled quite a bit within the U.S., at least I would say most of the relevant states, because there are some states that not much is happening.
The GDP drivers.
Yeah. And it's, the U.S. economy is just fascinating in the way they approach things is very pragmatic. And even in Europe, we, I think, lack that pragmatism. And as you can see nowadays with all the debates that are going on, you can see that Europe is kind of lagging behind on the whole ease of doing business, entrepreneurship. I mean, an entrepreneur in Europe is having really hard time these days. Or maybe in some cases, they're having too much of a hard time to start a business. And then once they started, there's too much being babysitted that it's not real entrepreneurship.
Yep.
It's like subsidized type of entrepreneurship. So they always have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D. An entrepreneur in Africa, to be honest, only has a plan A. If the plan A doesn't work, that's it. So for me, that's real risk taking, right? So, but in the US, right, that risk taking is I think, pretty well balanced with a bunch of things because, you'll have another entrepreneur buying your services because they can, because they want. And so, I mean, the whole thing, and of course, access to risk capital is also somewhat easy. So anyway, I think they've really got an A+ there in terms of entrepreneurship, and look where they are, right? You look at Japan, it's pretty much the same thing. This is one of the most capitalist type of economy where, and if you want to start a business from a small, whether you're an SME or a much larger corporation, things usually are pretty. I know people complain sometimes, but everything is relative, right? But here in Japan, also, it's very easy to start a business, to also stop it, and look where they are, right? So
Japan is known, certainly in the circles that I've sort of grown up around, is known for its infrastructure being able to facilitate almost anything. And so that echoes what you're saying in terms of the regulation to start and stop a business. And you've highlighted the difficulties Europe have in that regard. In some ways, Africa is an interesting blend because in some countries there is no regulation to have to worry about to get around. But the infrastructure is also in those cases severely lacking, and you're seeing public and impact funding coming in to sort of assist, and they then come with red tape and expectations and metrics and measures. I'm interested in your comment about the US saying, it's got entrepreneurship right. I think that has historically been the case, but you've obviously identified, as many of our commentators and some of our podcast guests have said, that Africa has the demographic bulge. Africa is the best position for entrepreneurship in the next sort of 50 to 100 years if we can get in the infrastructure and the technology. Yeah. So how is your sort of upbringing or what you've studied and seen around the world, how does that address that need in the market? Or would you agree with that analysis? What would you say differently? Or what have you seen that's different to that?
Yeah. And so, look, we always say, right, that the African continent is a young one, and we have that the human capital dividend, and we use all those words that it's true. And I think it's true. But
good buzzwords.
Yeah. But the thing is, you see, we're at a crossroad, because look at any country around the world that has moved into that middle income, because, they have certain metrics, right, for saying, okay, this is a low income, this is a middle income. I think between 2,000 to 5,000 GDP per capita, you're now into the middle income territory, etc. So, but usually what they've done when they've hit that middle income mark is that they were able also to somewhat turn that dividend, the human capital into a dividend, fine. But then somewhat also been able to really create, at least the same amount of jobs, if not more, right? But, and that's why I say we're at a crossroad now in most of our African countries. As you know, we're going to pretty much double the population of Africa, and then by 2050, 2060. And so it could either be a ticking bomb, and it's really going to blow up in our face, but really in a bad way this time around.
Right.
Because we've seen a bunch of revolutions, skirmishes here and there. All countries have gone through that, by the way, cycles. I mean, you look at France, we're in the fifth republic right now, fifth constitution. It took 5 iterations, 200 years almost to get to where we are. So, countries, and look, 20 years ago, there was a bunch of bombs still exploding in the south of France, whether it be Corsica. And so, but the thing is, if in Africa, we're not able to really manage this, what we have which is an asset, the youth, is really going to turn into a big security issue, right? A big liability. And so we need to create jobs at scale. Like we can't joke around with, one little job here, it's like we have to do it at scale. And so when you look at, okay, fine, how do you do this? The natural knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, let's have like massive projects of infrastructure building, construction. That's fine, but it's not enough. And also one thing to keep in mind, right? Because it's one thing to build massive infrastructure, etc. But if your geography is just not set up the way it's going to let you, then, because the infrastructure is one thing, but then it is a stepping stone into then, more trades, and so on and so forth, right? But if you're building an infrastructure and it's a bridge to nowhere, then, you're building it for nothing. So, and you
Yeah, and if I can interject, and I think what we've also found interesting is the case studies of countries that have made it work around the world. They're almost geography first, infrastructure second, because they identify what they can do. And you've seen these little countries or even islands become tax havens, or countries like Singapore becoming trading platforms, houses where a lot of trade goes through, financial systems. Mauritius is following a similar example. Rwanda is an example of how a tiny landlocked country is trying to resuscitate trade in its locale. So I think that's an interesting set of points. What I also appreciate is you're saying it's beyond a PR problem. So it's not just that people don't understand Africa. There is a genuine need to address some of the challenges that the countries have, which I think I fundamentally agree with, although I think PR is also a problem. So it's great that there's more people coming to know Africa through the work that you do. If I could ask this question a little differently, Africa is by some viewed as a very homogeneous country. And of course, it's a continent with several countries that all have immense diversity. Has that perception changed at all? Are you finding international investors or international firms are interested in learning about the differences across the continent, or is it still viewed very much as, well, it's a young workforce, lots of minerals, and, let's tackle it all at once?
I mean, I think it's the latter, Ben. I mean, look, I think we have to be honest with ourselves that we haven't done a good job at, there's some efforts here and there. Rwanda right now is showing up on the Paris Saint-Germain jersey. Fine, good job. But in the grand scheme of things, we haven't done much. So I think it's the latter, Ben. I think we're still, and people they got offended last time, for instance, when Donald Trump said Lesotho, a country that, because I think it's in your backyard, right? So
right, yeah.
I think that example, but look, we have to put ourselves in their shoes, right? I mean, like they don't even know how to spell Ethiopia, and you can't blame the guy for whether it be Donald Trump or anyone else, right, for not knowing where Ethiopia is. Like, why would they need to know about it, right? From a trade standpoint, it's a speck in direction for them. In terms of actual, historical, in the grand scheme of things, because everything is relative, right? So it's really for them, not something that. Unless, fine, sometimes there's some issues here and there that they need to manage. And so, there's a terrorist group here and there. So now you have to set up a base. And so for security issues, fine. But in the grand scheme of things, why would an American investor know where Cape Verde is, or Lesotho, or maybe Kenya to an extent, right? But I think it's still we're still at a point where most of the world doesn't know us. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, Ben, if your also feelings got hurt. My feelings get hurt when sometimes, people say, oh, we're going to build, maybe last time there was this example of, people were going on about, okay, make Europe great again, make Asia great again,
right.
Latin America great again. And they finished the sentence. Silence. And it was like, wait. Didn't you forget a continent? No. Wait, did I forget?
No.
So I think, the either silence or sometimes the complete, forgetting of Africa is really telling. Is that we haven't done a good job at showing up, at explaining ourselves. And also, I think in some cases that being very honest with ourselves, because it starts within, right? Because you can't explain something without that it within is not correct. Like going back just very quickly to that geography thing, Ben, I think we have to be honest with ourselves. When you look at the geography of Africa, right? It's just because you said something very important. You said we need to really build a trade locally. So, for instance, within Ethiopia, we need to build massive roads, bridges, etc. Then I think trade locally is very important, very important. But then, for me to send a pair of shoes from Ethiopia to maybe Dakar, Senegal, it's much, much, much more expensive than for that same manufacturer to send it from Shenzhen to Dakar, right?
Right.
So if we're honest with ourselves about this whole geography challenge, I think then we can explain and PR Africa in a much better way. We shouldn't also solve problems that in some cases cannot be solved. Like, for instance, the trading of the goods for me is between African countries is important. We need to try that. But again, like the quantity is not going to be one that's going to enable a massive growth of most of these economies. So again, we have to focus on the reality. And the reality is that we have to trade on services. And so once you have strong local economies that are thriving, you can then trade services between African countries. And the beauty is that there's something called digital nowadays. And through digital, you can make payments, you can exchange services, and you can do many, many things. And for me, I think that's going to be the silver bullet for Africa, is to create a bunch of manufacturing jobs, industrial type of revolution. Because, sometimes we have also this fantasy that we can leapfrog everything, where we can't.
That we can leapfrog. I was going to ask you that. So that's the common response to what you've just shared. And people use examples like M-Pesa, saying, well, look, Africa can do it. We leapfrogged into mobile money. In some cases, we haven't had to develop fixed line infrastructure because we've just gone straight to satellite. And so that's the common response. But I hear, and I tend to agree, or certainly you've got a convincing argument for why we need to start a little bit more fundamental, build out trade, build out service level, not just agreements between countries, but actually production facilities, trade agreements. And of course, the African trade agreement is under a bit of threat at the moment, given the American policies, particularly affecting South Africa. But let's look a little bit broader than that. Africa itself has, as you call it, a dividend, this youth dividend, which for anyone who's unaware is the expected rate of population growth in Africa, should mean that by 2050, I think it's 1/3 or close to half of all working population will have come from African descent. And then it goes, I think that sort of holds true for the next 50, 60 years based on current population demographics. Now that, of course, should provide massive opportunity for a workforce that is skilled, educated, and hungry to stay on the continent. All three of those, I would argue, are under threat. We don't have the skills, we are struggling to educate, and there's this great PR void. Why would you stay in Africa when you could go and then fill in the blank to whichever of the other continents you decide? So those, I think, if I could position those as the bear case for Africa, we've got our best, most skilled, educated people leaving for the brighter lights of elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you could give us the elevator pitch for Africa. What is the story that offers the bull case? We asked Ronak Gopal, he was our guest a short while ago. So a similar question to you, paint us the positive long-term vision for Africa's future.
Let's be positive, right? So look, I'm not going to talk about like all the resources we have under our feet, because, there's a bunch of things there. But for me, it's almost like, are you a Messi or Ronaldo? I think Messi was born with the natural skills and Ronaldo is really working hard, right? I prefer Ronaldo because he's working hard. Africa, if you have those resources under our feet, fine, but we need to work hard. We need to be a Ronaldo. And so this is the elevator pitch for me, I think, for Africa, is the fact that, again, we have these massive youths, because you have to be there to actually experience it. It's a density, but it's a positive density of people who are hungry, thirsty for knowledge. And for me, that's the key, is a young, I'm sorry about the young Californian sitting on his couch, a 17-year-old, but he's not as thirsty for knowledge as that same 17-year-old who's walking around in sandals, whose cell phone is barely working, and yet he's going to be spending his nights under maybe at somewhat of a dark room, maybe a bit cold, and still trying to get to maybe this last course of coding that he's been trying to get to understand, to really get a certificate. And so, long story short, we have a very, I think, thirsty youth that's thirsty for knowledge that could really be leveraged for good things, right? And fine. Some of these folks, they have also pretty strong hands. So we need to put those strong hands at work for manufacturing. But I think what we have also is a lot of brains, and some of them entrepreneurs, right? Because we also can, for every one entrepreneur, you have 99 workers, right? It's not like in a room of 100, you had 99 entrepreneurs. That's also, I think, another also thing that we've been fed is that everyone, you need to be job creator. You can't be just job seekers. Well, but, those are the statistics. And so I think for the next 30 years, Africa could really create a bunch of new types of jobs that we even never thought about, like in the gig economy. So I think this is where I think we can leapfrog, because the future of work, comes into the picture when you don't have a legacy of very difficult labor rules and regulations, right? So I think in Africa, if we enable ourselves, we could really create gig economies, the freelance economies. I think maybe outsourcing, we have to be careful because the train is really leaving the station. First, it was with robotics, process automation, and now AI, I think, is going to do away with really all of the outsourcing over time. But I think for the future of work, like new types of jobs, Africa really has a chance to create a bunch of new types of jobs that can create really new markets, right? And this is where I think...
And those markets you mentioned, manufacturing, you also mentioned servicing. In the digital economy, it's easy to see the opportunity to use the arbitrage of price, where dollar or euro based companies might pay a much higher fee for the services that an African can offer. We're seeing that being enabled, particularly through the infrastructure of Starlink and a few other internet service providers. Mm-hmm. Where else do you think, if you were to comment just on sectors, where else do you think that there's opportunity? You don't need to sort of go too detailed in each one, but maybe you could give us a view based on the clients that you have. Where are they looking, and what sort of businesses is Africa primed to really see thrive?
Yeah, so look, we have a project, and we started this whole thing, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, the Frog Economy for Freelancing, Outsourcing, and Gigs. And we were advising the Jobs Creation Commission at the time of Ethiopia and saying, we really need to bank on those kinds of jobs. But now currently we're on a consortium and we're part of a group creating what we hope is going to be 1 million jobs in the next few years, mostly for young women, but really focused again on the gig economy. So to answer your question, I mean, this is happening in all sectors. It could be tourism, it could be health, right? Let's take health for a second. So in the health sector, as you said it rightfully, for instance, Nigeria is exporting a bunch of doctors to the UK. Same goes for Ethiopia. We have more, I think, qualified doctors abroad than within. And then the ones that we have quantities also within, but they can't find jobs. But now look what the gig economy is doing, right? It's connecting the dots. So someone in a region, maybe the western region of Ethiopia, is educated, skilled, and they just graduated, but they can't find a job. But someone in the southern region needs some kind of service, right? And that skilled worker is going to now, through the digital means and payments and that whole infrastructure that we were talking about earlier, is going to be able to exchange services with this person through telemedicine. But then you also have sometimes in-person type of services as well that maybe in the past were not common, even in Africa. Or even Europe, for that, like home care type of services. That's what I'm referring to. And so now maybe a nurse who she's pretty qualified, but she can't find a job for a number of reasons. But now through this digital economy, she's able to being connected through to the different service seekers, right?
Right.
And so
Bernard, I wanted to ask on that point particularly, and to tie up to what you said a bit earlier. African culture is quite different. If you are going to be providing jobs from a continent apart, whether that's digital or in-person training over time, understanding the differences between how people engage and how they work, the ethos of a particular culture or people's, I mean, that can be quite a big factor. And you mentioned that some of the work that you do in your advisory services is to assist in those cultural gaps, bridging the cultural divide, so to speak. Now, you yourself speak multiple languages. You've worked in various cities across the world. you've built out a firm now advising into Africa. Give us a sense of what maybe a cultural advisor looks like, or the sort of work you do in that component of the advisory service.
Yeah. So, and then by the way, the beauty of technology is that it makes it a level playing field. And then in some cases, between a service seeker and the one providing that service, the exchange of information becomes easy thanks to technology, because it creates that level playing field. They're using the same language, but of course, in not all cases. Now, coming to the example of a Japanese investor who's maybe a large corporation, and it could be like a trading company or what have you, and who's now already maybe present in India, but now wants to expand further into Africa, because maybe they're already present in Africa through their contract manufacturer in India, but now they actually want to build in, pick your favorite country, Kenya. So it would be a made in Kenya, but like made with Japan type of product, right? And so, and so maybe I didn't pick the right example for my the next aspect, which is unions, right? And so in some countries, you have a maybe culture. In France, we have a culture of striking. But in some African countries, you may also have that culture of maybe not striking as much as the French, but a little bit. But whereas in Japan, you have unions, but I would say in the last few decades, because they also had some pretty violent things happening back in the 60s, 70s, but in the last few decades, a Japanese corporation is not going to experience that type of, for instance, strike, right? And so now this person comes into that African country and experiences these kinds of things. They don't speak the same language in terms of that whole like union and strikes and everything relationship, right? So that's the barrier to success, because if you can't control your labor, chances are, your manufacturing plant is not going to be as efficient. And then after years, you start shutting it down. So culture has and I picked a very specific example here that's related to unions, but sometimes it's as simple as even how do you show up to meetings, right? If the person on the other side is showing up late because their time is elastic and they feel like they're actually doing you a favor because, they're letting you prepare and everything. Whereas the other person for them, time is not elastic and they expect you to show up on time. It creates tensions. And for deals to go through, tensions usually are not the best recipe, right? And in some cases, for sure, it's, I can give you examples, for instance, like, I'm not going to name the specific companies, but of a large telco, for instance, coming into a country and after 2 years being sent off the country because there was some very deep cultural issues of how they manage, the talent, how they manage decisions, and so on and so forth. So culture is very important with our culture factor partner. We have different methodologies in the way we look at those things. It could be decision making, it could be hierarchy. So there's a different parameters, and it's never a science, right? It's not a science. But the idea is,
and I suppose for a company coming in, and not only do they not know what they don't know, but even if they do know that there's a gap and they've identified it, bridging that gap and having localized support on the ground that's got the experience, exposure, and again that sort of has the language, it must make a huge difference. I wonder if you can give us any particular interesting clients you've worked with. I'm not sure if you can share names, but maybe what's the most interesting project that's come across your desk in the last 5 years?
I mean, I'm trying to find the one maybe that's not as political or that's not going to get in trouble. Yeah. So here we go. So you have a Japanese client who, how Japanese, right? They are, they like to host properly. They really think of your feelings ahead of time. So they'll maybe bring you gifts, even in a corporate setting, right? Or maybe with high-level officials, etc. And so they really care about these things. So I'm giving you like a very pragmatic example, but that is telling the rest of the relationship. And so now this client is going to bring like a bunch of different gifts. And guess what? When they actually land in that country, it's not that those gifts are not appreciated, but they may sound for that high-level official, they may come across as two things. Number one is, do you think that I'm a corrupt person? And so that trying to basically, quote unquote, corrupt me with this kind of gift? Number one.
Was gifting, sure.
Yeah. Number two is, it's kind of perceived maybe as you're trying to twist my arm to do something. And so, and then by the way, in some cases, it's not the gift in and of itself. It's also the timing of it, right? And so maybe the counterpart there in, again, I'm not going to name the specific country, but in that African country will want to first have those business conversations. And in this case, by the way, it was a high-level official, actually official, right? Because it happened multiple times. And then let's maybe exchange these gifts if the conversation goes well, and then maybe we can even have some coffee or tea, right? And so I think it's usually good to do your homework ahead of time because so that's just like, let's say, business development.
That's good intentions, just not meeting the expected outcome because of the cultural context.
Exactly.
Which is, I suppose, a risk that you don't really think of in doing business in another country.
Yeah. And then I'll give you also one of my favorite examples, right? Of like, forget about the Japanese, but now a cowboy coming from America, and I love our friends in America, but sometimes they can really act like cowboys. And anyway, now you go to the Middle East, right? And you know how Americans, right? They like to really, and it's good, in their context, they like to discuss, to negotiate, to brainstorm. These are all American terms, actually, right? Brainstorm, to bounce ideas,
Okay, yeah.
Whereas, for instance, a Middle Eastern culture expects more of a lecture and expects you to transfer the knowledge and asking, I hired you to give me a certain amount of expertise. So give me that expertise and please leave. Maybe it doesn't harsh, but the point is, you don't expect me to, if I'm the client, to brainstorm with you, right? That's a very American. So that's number one. Number two is, in terms of figuring out who the decision maker is in a room, even the seating arrangement can be very, very confusing for an American. And by the way, I'm not going to get into the Japanese aspect because it's even more when you come to Japan. But there's a seating arrangement in the US versus a seating arrangement in the Middle East, in one of the GCC countries, actually, is very different. You'll find sometimes a decision maker in a GCC country sitting all the way in the back, not saying anything, right? And the people around the table, around what you would have thought is like really the decision room, are really almost the assistants, right? So you're spending your time is like pitching those guys, like trying to brainstorm, but they're not brainstorming with you, and they're trying to really convince them. And at the end of the meeting, the guy all the way in the back stands up and says, "This is not good." So yeah, it's very interesting for me to follow these things because it can really have an impact.
Yeah, that's a great example, and I'm sure one that not many people have come across, but can envisage happening across the continent. Yeah. As we wrap up, I've got a few more questions I'd love to send your way. One of my favorite things to talk about in the context of investing is the strength of ecosystems supporting founders. This is now in the small businesses, and I'm linking this up to your earlier comment on the need for business to get built locally. And so, one of the best stories of the world, or certainly the most PR'd story of the world, is the ecosystem of San Francisco, particularly Silicon Valley. and how that tech sort of hub has led to the build out of technology from that little ecosystem across the world. Could you help us maybe compare San Francisco or that culture to any part of Africa? Have you traveled into the continent and found anything that's, if not an analog to it, at least similar or on the trajectory towards what you saw when you were working there?
Yeah, I mean, look, by the way, the whole Silicon Valley ecosystem is very hard to replicate because the reason why the risk profile there is so high in terms of, or the risk taking appetite, let's say, is so high that it's very difficult to replicate, even in other countries such as, France, even Berlin, right? They've been trying in Germany to replicate but it's very difficult to have that much risk taking in other economies. So I think comparing African ecosystems to Silicon Valley is a bit, I would say, unfair, but let's take a shot at it, right? So the first aspect is definitely just the sheer amount of risk capital. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's just not there, right? I think Africa raises one day we were doing this math, right? And I'm sorry, it's almost laughable, but Africa raises in a year what Silicon Valley raises. I think it was a week or something like that. Something almost for the whole continent. Can you imagine? So that's number one. But for me, that at some point, can be solved if you have the right amount of investors stepping in, the local investors. Because sometimes you look at Nigeria and we all congratulate ourselves and say, wow, look at this is an example, especially in fintech, they're raising so much money. Fine, good job. And definitely they shouldn't refuse foreign risk capital that's coming into the country, but it's still foreign risk capital. Where are the local investors, right? And local investment is important because that's how you also keep kind of the know-how and you increase actually the knowledge in that specific vertical. But anyway, for me, what's a bit more concerning, because the capital at some point, somehow we can solve it some way, is the culture, right? The culture of...
the risk-taking culture you're speaking of.
Well, no, I mean, for me, it's more about, if I'm an entrepreneur, I'm going to go and actually purchase services from another entrepreneur. And that for me is an amazing culture that you see in Silicon Valley. You have really a small entrepreneur who raised maybe like 500K in USD, right? Which is somewhat small in the US. They'll turn around and buy a piece of software, not because it's cheap, but because they want to. From someone who's sitting across the aisle in that same co-working space, and for me, I feel like that culture of things are not going to be a zero-sum game, that if you win, I can win, that, if you lose, maybe we'll lose together too. But the point is, we are in this together type of culture, and that your winning doesn't come at the risk of me losing. You know what I mean? So I think that culture for me is even more one thing that needs to be emphasized. And for me, that's worrying because I haven't seen it, to be honest, I traveled to many African countries and I haven't seen it really playing out in real time. And it's actually sometimes the opposite. Really, like you're doing something and you're like, hey, can you, right? I mean, if I'm a payment company, maybe I want to partner with a logistics company and then, we can all grow together, because if I can become the oil for that logistics company in terms of payment, they'll get more transactions for them, more business for me, right? That's how you would think. But people kind of look at it in silos. And so for me, that's a bit worrying. Now, I don't want to paint too much of a dark picture, because I think the reason for that's my theory, I may be wrong, is because the pie is somewhat small today.
Yeah.
And that's why maybe we have this culture of a bit, elbowing each other instead of coming together and embracing each other. I mean, we talk about Ubuntu and
mentality of a mentality that is seldom one of sort of gifting and generosity, but often quite selfish, which is ironic because Ubuntu as a cultural tenet of Africa is so well recognized across the world.
Yeah, so that's maybe the good way to conclude this example. I mean, the comparison is, I really want to see a Ubuntu of entrepreneurship, of like an entrepreneur who's again selling or has maybe some kind of payment company who's partnering with the agri-tech, even though that agri-tech feels small. The agri-tech now is partnering up with or buying services from a Logitech company, and so on and so forth, right? So that's very important, and I hope
that's where we've got to get to.
Yeah.
And I think so. The positive that I'll leave a bit of a good spin on it as we wrap. There are some organizations that are making it their mission to do so. Of course, there's various private sources of wealth doing that, whether that's funds or permanent capital vehicles across the continent, but there's also initiatives like the Jasiri organization, which is growing from the sort of ground up. Entrepreneurs that are linked, they go through cohort training right across the continent to meet each other, to connect, and hopefully to do business. So what's positive is that not only are others recognizing it, but there's starting to be the idea of addressing it.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you one last question. And it's one of my favorites because I never know what's going to come. What question should I have asked you today? What would you have liked to share? Maybe your favorite question about Africa or the work you do, an insight that I should have asked you and didn't get the opportunity. So why don't you end with that?
Sure. I mean, maybe it's a good segue into what we were talking about, right? But I think perhaps the question, right, would have been around what is it that we Africans should focus our efforts on in terms of building new markets, etc. I think we've touched on this already, so I'm just trying to
emphasize. Yeah, and
it's really about to not hesitate to work on the boring aspect. It may sound a bit counterintuitive or maybe even provocative, but we use this term leapfrogging and so on and so forth.
Yes.
But you touched on it earlier. If you have a road with a bunch of potholes, good luck building your e-commerce platform, right? So we need to build roads. If you want to have a bunch of EV vehicles, but it's very difficult to have a network of recharging stations, then again, good luck. So we need to work on the boring aspect of work, doing like the difficult, I would say, because sometimes it's difficult to build these massive, and in some ways not massive infrastructure, but at least these basic things, right? Even something as simple as parking. Like you go to Addis Ababa, for instance, and parking is very difficult. Parking your car. And why is it? I mean, it's because we haven't even built the basic things of like this easy technology of, you have a space and you put some kind of a machine there, and it's going to count the amount of cars and make the payment, and off you go, right? So we have to work also on the boring, and we can't just always think about leapfrogging everything, and then only the sexy stuff like, I'm sometimes also guilty of it. Like we had the AI capability with our partner, but it can't always be like AI, machine learning, blockchain, and we have to also work on the boring aspects.
That's well said, and I think also a theme and a trend that we're seeing in our investment cases. We're primarily a food and agri fund. That's our background, and the need for agriculture, the development of supply chain, all the way through to table is so vast that you almost could focus on it at the exclusion of everything else, because of how important it is, how big the need is. Bernard, it's such a pleasure to talk to you and get to know the perspective that you bring. And if I could commend your work, because the more people know about Africa and the better Africa is resourced and advised, the better for everyone, which I think you'd agree with. How could people get in touch with you if they wanted to find out more? Perhaps they are interested in a reciprocal relationship, either profiling their own company for external interest, or maybe making connection through yourself into Japan. How could they get in touch?
Yeah, and by the way, I want to also commend the work that you do, Ben, because getting the word out there, hosting different people and let them also tell their stories. I think, again, kudos to you guys. For us, I mean, the best way to contact us is to get on our website. So, the mothership is laurendeauandassociates.com. I know it's a bit difficult, but
and we'll post a link. Yeah,
yeah, and then we also have Enkopa Lab, so here in Tokyo, and yeah, you can get in touch with us, and then also like to join. We have an expert network called The Circle, because going back to that brain drain, we need experts to join us in adopting more and more clients. So thanks again, Ben. I really appreciate the time with you.
No, wonderful. So we'll post those links in the podcast, but it's been a real pleasure, and all the best for the year ahead.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Shapers, Makers, Builders and Breakers. We trust that you've been encouraged by what you've just heard. Subscribe to future episodes and find out more about us at shaperspodcast.co.za. That is shaperspodcast.co.za.
Well, that's right. Don't forget to subscribe for new episodes and other content, and remember, share any feedback with us. We'd love to hear from you. Find me on Twitter at b_d_shaw or via email. We look forward to your company the next time on Shapers, Makers, Builders and Breakers. Until that time, cheers, bye-bye.